Hello, everyone. This should be, I hope, an intriguing and humble dialogue, because the notion of using language to explain our circumstances, and then the language itself having the ability to help us think as designers, whether we're being intentional or not, is, I think, a critical one. So the idea of a new language for carbon is something that really grew out of years of discussing the idea that people who are trying to be less bad really want to think about what it would also mean to be more good. And when Michael Braungart and I wrote about that in Cradle to Cradle, and the issue of a material being good or bad is really a question of the relationship to that material. Toxins are often described as materials that are in the wrong place at the wrong dose with the wrong duration. So almost anything in excess can overwhelm you. For example, water. So the description of something as good or bad really depends a lot on context and also on human behavior. So if you're using a tool, its value is determined by your intention. As we've talked about before, a hammer in the hands of a child is a toy, in the hands of a carpenter is a house, and in the hands of a maniac is a weapon. But the tool itself is innocent. It's just a hammer. So as we go forward, what we can do is start to think about the language around carbon. And we look at the issues of carbon in the world today. This sketch from Australia shows fossil fuels in industry in terms of carbon cycle releases. It shows land use changes. This is deforestation, paving, urban growth, so on. If we look at where that carbon goes, you see that the land sinks are actually being active because of the increased carbon. The atmosphere is taking the light blue, and the ocean is taking a part of it. And so clearly land use as a sink will not be adequate to the purposes. And so the idea that we must now recognize that carbon in the atmosphere is essentially a toxin, and that we have to stop putting it there because it's the fundamental question, and then we can also look at other questions around it, but it is the fundamental one. So I was asked by the journal Nature to submit this thought in a form of an essay, and they entitled it "Carbon is Not the Enemy." And it's available, obviously, on Nature's site. And this is where I put it forward, and we published it during Marrakesh, the COP22 proceedings. And so here's where it comes from. The idea that we look at carbon with straightforward grace and respect it as a dignified material that actually is critical to our life, and then characterize it. And so when I heard that a country announced it was going to try and be a carbon negative country as a positive thing, I found it very sad, because I was trying to understand how I could explain that to a child, that carbon negative country is a good thing. That because carbon negative is only going to be a good thing if carbon itself is negative. So less of a bad thing. But carbon in the atmosphere is a problem. But carbon itself isn't bad. So I decided to look at perhaps characterizing the carbon in its position and its use. And then we could talk about the behaviors being negative or positive, things like that. So the illustration here that's from Nature is for three basically kinds of carbon, in a sense, at this point. On the left is fugitive carbon that has escaped and has gone to the atmosphere beyond natural levels. Durable carbon, where we've used the carbon to make things, plastics, or there are things that are carboniferous like limestone, mountains that are sitting there quietly, being durable. And then living carbon. This is carbon in the soils accruing to the living form and collection of photons and using photosynthesis for growth and things like that. And then if we look at our behaviors, we realize our management of the carbon becomes negative if we turn it into a toxin in the atmosphere or allow bottles or plastics to get in the ocean, fugitive carbon. We're carbon neutral if we can recycle plastics or wood beams and things over centuries. And we're carbon positive if we perpetuate the accrual of carbon in soil and living forms. So this is essentially the diagram. So on the left, if we have carbon going to this is, on the left, carbon that is fugitive, it's escaped, and that would be methane, naturally carbon dioxide, things like that. And these things can end up in the oceans as changing its pH, as we see in ocean acidification. It can also be durable carbons, things that we've made from fossil fuels or from carbohydrates that we've made into durable goods that end up in untoward places like plastics in the ocean, for example. Now that we hear numbers being put out there like the one we've heard recently, that in 2050 the oceans will have plastics equal in weight to that of fish in the oceans. It's pretty astonishing to start to think about these kinds of dynamics at this scale. So the second would be durable carbon in the middle there, and that'd be a limestone mountain minding its business. But it's also a kind of durable carbon being a carbon neutral behavior. And we'll talk about this further, but when we look at the fact that renewable power, for example, carbon free, that you end up in terms of its operations from various forms of solar income, that these objects, which obviously need energy to make them in the first place, but they're not producing carbon in the atmosphere. These are sort of carbon neutral behaviors. And then as we look at the soils, we can talk about how to increase the benefit of soil with carbon from the atmosphere. So first is carbon fugitive, second, durable, with a circular economy. This is, I think, an important point, that the circular economy, which is really the second condition of cradle to cradle, first being healthy materials, biological and technical cycles. This idea of durable in a circular economy is a really important one. So we really can support the circular economy, especially of good things, because if we make things that are poisonous, for example, and then we recirculate them over and over again and retoxify them, that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing a good thing, you're just doing it again. So circular is critical in terms of reuse across generations, and ideally these are safe and healthy things that are being reused across generations, not recirculating things that we don't want. And then living carbon, which we're all familiar with because we're all alive, is obviously the basis of living beings and of photosynthetic behavior. So carbon negative behavior would be burning plastics for fuel, for example. So often, we hear of waste to energy plants being described as a form of renewable energy, and especially here in the United States. And, that we have to question them is because we've just turned a durable into a fugitive, something like that. So that we could characterize as carbon negative behavior, and it helps us realize that we really don't want to be doing waste to energy. We don't want to lose the valuable carbon to the atmosphere, or sort of not take advantage of the opportunity of having perpetual benefit from it. So that becomes a design question of how we design and use plastics, for example. The carbon neutral is really important, especially when we get to the end of this talk, where certain things you'll hear people say about their behavior with carbon. They'll say, for example, we're net zero, and they'll talk about net zero energy or things like that. And I think the idealized form there is renewably powered things, but you also see people saying net zero when they're balancing carbon releases with renewable power. And, when we stop and think about that, it may be a little bit awkward because of the science involved, and we'll come to that in a minute. But the other is this carbon positive behavior. So as we can start to imagine taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and bringing it down to Earth and doing things with it, but also we can imagine, supporting photosynthetic behavior. So there we go. And then the other element that needs to be brought into the discussion, I think, is human use. So this is a concept known as usufruct, the idea that things are here for our use. So that we have another layer, which we could call working carbon. And in soil, if we're using it for human purposes, then it would be working carbon. This would be like agriculture. And as we work to get carbon in the soil, and certainly a lot of agricultural practice today is not accruing carbon in soil. Other enterprises that are now experimenting with compost and soil building strategies that have been around since the beginning are showing that once these carbon cycles start into gear, they can perpetuate themselves even, in a sense, by accruing more carbon over time, and get that kick-started with the various microorganisms and processes that do that. So when we're using it for agriculture, working carbon. When we're using it for bottles, things like that, polymers, various paper things, these are working carbon. This is used by humans. And then if we burn it for energy to run our systems, then it's working fugitive carbon. So the question of what can we do about it? Well, one would be, stop perpetuating the things we don't want. It's really not about just minimizing your fugitive releases. That certainly is a good thing to be doing, but it's really about stopping. Because if you stop and think about it as a toxin, if you have lead in your water for children, we don't just say we'll reduce it by 20% by 2020. We say we're going to stop doing that. And the people who do that are considered, in many cases, criminal. So it's not just about reducing it; it's actually about stopping it once you realize it's this kind of problem. So let's all get together and both reduce it, but also exchange it for something else. So then the second thing would be to design perpetual assets, durable carbon. So that would be the circular economy. This is about using plastics, and like the carpets we do with Shaw Industries are designed to be safe, healthy carpets again. So the raw materials are being stored on customers' floors. This is a strategy for the use of these materials over and over again across generations in safe ways. And then the products of service, we call this. And then we perpetuate living carbon when we can. That's why in urban design or in our architecture today, we're designing buildings that make food on the roof and have green roofs, and we're looking at urban landscapes that are green instead of gray and soft instead of hard, and looking at new biodegradable polymers that can regenerate soil activity as they degrade and compost into the soils over various periods of time. So to put it back into this nutshell idea of being less bad is not being good, it's being bad but less so, we realize that this notion that we're always trying to just do less of what we don't want is certainly worthwhile, but it's not that inspiring, and it doesn't really tell us where we're going, except what we're not going to do. And so the goal becomes zero, which is, in the case of carbon in the atmosphere, unnaturally, is obviously very useful. Metric, but also useful, would be what we've talked about before, which
I think super powerful concept, Bill, that I think would take a while for people to grasp the power of it. But this notion of thinking of carbon as valuable as opposed to something to get rid of is a fundamental shift in the way to think about it, and thinking about then how to capture something that's valuable and reuse it instead of reduce it is pretty powerful. I'm curious if you see any examples of companies who have made this conceptual shift and had it impact their design, and can you give us a few examples?
I think that the examples are probably going to be from the obvious to the sort of new intention. And the obvious might be the example I used of the looking for carbon negative was Bhutan. And Bhutan's prime minister announced at TED that they were wanting to be a carbon negative country. And I think if you look at the information, and I'd have to basically back all this up with a little more review, but it was essentially what I saw superficially is that they're sequestering 3 times as much carbon with their forests as they release in burning wood and so on. And so it's a 3-time carbon to soil equation, or to biota. And then they sell hydroelectricity to neighbors and things like that. So that would be carbon neutral. And so I think that actually is a carbon positive country in this language. And you could characterize that as people who are doing that. And they're doing it because they believe in it, and they've been doing it for a very long time. So it's not a new shift. It's just that the language might want to become positive, because I think that's a good thing they're doing, is measuring and caring and behaving in this beautiful way. So, okay, that would be one where what they're already doing would be recharacterized. On the other hand, there are people who are now talking about becoming carbon positive. And so the fact that we could start to give that some definition, but what does that mean? And it doesn't just mean adding renewables, it means removing the carbon emissions. That distinction, I think, is important. So for example, Unilever has expressed its carbon positive ambition. So that's a very important statement by them. And if you track what that implies, it would mean the company is headed towards renewable power. And it's similar to Walmart, because as you know, I work with Walmart for a very long time, and at various times doing various things. And if you look at Walmart's goal on the energy front, it is to be 100% renewably powered. That's a very specific statement. It's not less carbon in the atmosphere by 2020. It's 100% renewably powered. So that's a really powerful example of what we're talking about here.
Great. I'm seeing a question from Lex Hundersdorfer in Portland, who is asking specifically if there's any other industries other than architectural and design. You mentioned energy, that you feel like would be important to embrace this new language for their production processes.
Well, one that I really care a lot about right now is plastics and polymers and packaging.
Yes.
I just think the whole world of packaging is ready for a reboot. It's terrible, frankly. And the minute we start to realize these can be perceived as assets and characterized and used that way, the sooner we get that moving, the better. So I think it really does matter for us to find a way to make sure that the plastics have value, and that they have value in their recovery as well. Very hard to do with prices of oil doing and the way things are currently designed. We could also be designing for recyclability, which is an initiative we see very dramatically going on with the Walmarts and Unilevers and people who care about this kind of cradle-to-cradle thinking, and the circular economy is part of it. We need to be able to get things back, concentrate them, and flow them. And right now, the way packaging is designed, it essentially just scatters to the wind or the oceans, and in many places to major detrimental effect. So I think one of the big ones is packaging and how to concentrate and flow the residues that are put out into the environment by people, because the design of the packaging is such that it has no value. Or it's such a highly complex thing, like most of the pouches, that they don't have a direct pathway to soil, be it through industrial composting or home composting or soil composting on one hand, or back to technical cycles on the other, because the complexity makes it difficult to concentrate and flow it in valuable supply chains.
That's great. I'm loving seeing some examples from our listeners of companies that they are aware of that are producing products or practices that are being presented as carbon positive. I've noticed that Patagonia's new product, perennial grain, I can't even read what it says, but really interesting cross-section between a food company, or one of Patagonia's food lines, and Fetzer, the wine company here in the Napa Valley. We have a great audience online today, and I would really encourage any of you to share other pointers to products or operations that you see are leading examples that we can add to our library. And then I have another question here that says, what suggestions would you offer to companies other than RECs, PPAs, or so on in pursuit of carbon management when a shift to on-site renewables is cost prohibitive or otherwise limited?
Would you like me to take that one first?
Yeah, that's fine. Mm-hmm.
Well, these other examples you have, Patagonia, Fetzer, and so on, are terrific, because these are companies that have this as part of their DNA, to constantly search for the right thing and work very hard at it and find ways to make the business-like proposition, but it's at the core of who they are in their case as well. So it's a values exercise as well as a value one. I think on the renewable power one, that what can people do as we bring it on home? I think it's at the risk of being obvious. It is reduce your consumption to the extent you can, of course, and then you start looking around for the closest renewable energy at the most intimate scale you can. You keep it as close to the community you're in as you can. So I think all those instincts that keep it local, keep it close by, reduce the amount of transmission costs, transportation costs of goods, services, electricity, and so on. All those things are part of the search for the good. And with renewable power, when you say you can't afford it, you can design for it and just say you're going to do it as soon as you can afford it, if that's the question. And it's surprising how fast it's coming. When I was in Marrakesh, we were meeting with IRENA from MESAR, the International Renewable Energy Agency, and two data points were just amazing. One I had heard earlier from SunPower, which was that a solar system in Dubai had been sold at 2.9 cents kilowatt hour. I think it was Dubai, it might have been Abu Dhabi, but anyway, in the Emirates, and that one recently sold for 2.4 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, admittedly, you're in a sunny spot, but 2.4 cents a kilowatt hour. Natural gas is 6, wind is 6. The game is on, folks. The game is on. Solar is a commodity, and prices are, approaching commodity prices for the collectors themselves. The balance of system obviously becomes the key cost, but that's why you can design into your systems the day this is going to arrive. If you can anticipate it. That's Mr. Fuller.
Great advice. I love this question about how can a service-based industry go about converting fugitive carbon into durable or living carbon. We hear that a lot from service-based industries where they have a harder time wrapping their head around how to think about sustainability, other than the answer to your last question about renewables.
Well, this is, service is a human behavior. And, if you're in service, then you need to be serviced in order to do it. And you can catalog what you require to do your work. And it's not to say that we aren't using whatever means possible to do the offsets or to directly power what we're doing. But, as time goes on, we'll see, especially I think with transportation, as we see the linkage between solar and wind in the Midwest with batteries and optimizations around various diurnal cycles and seasonal cycles, that these kinds of things will get optimized over time. So if you're an Uber driver, you can imagine being an electric vehicle. And you can imagine working from solar energy at some point relatively soon in these systems that are going to be doing optimization, having things like what's going on with home batteries and solar for people, and you can charge up at night if you wanted to. I mean, you can actually get clever and enjoy yourself around the opportunities to just do constant improvement. So service businesses certainly know how to do math, so this isn't that hard, really. It's a matter of planning and intentionality.
Add some beautiful living walls in your building and compost. Simple.
Yeah, exactly.
Local.
That's people, and also it's part of life. They're beautiful.
That's absolutely. I'm interested. Interesting question about how the government might adopt this language to help support the private sector. I'm not sure really where the question is there, but how could this new language be adopted by government programs to support private sector? We need more education inside government.
It's a very odd question given this very moment in this country, for example.
Yes.
But I think that if our governments are going to be a representative of the people, and one would hope that was the case, then I think the important thing is the search for the good. Because if we look even
Yes.
at the current political system, or not the system, but the manifestation going on around this kind of issue, I think generally we can see that strange things such as what Jane Jacobs characterized as the relationship between the guardian and commerce. So you talk about what can the governments do. The governments are guardian. They're meant to be the guardian of the public benefit and the public weal, the public health, and the public assets. And they're the guardian. Then you've got commerce, which is business, which is the engine of change, powered by markets and money. And then you can ask yourself at this moment, there's some very quizzical things going on. One that struck me when I was at the World Economic Forum this year, working with the Ice House and Circular Economy, and with Ellen MacArthur and the WEF folks on the new plastics economy and design for circularity. We, clearly heard, as it did everyone else, that the announcement that 8 individuals, 6 of whom are American, have as much wealth as 3.5 billion people on the bottom half of the economic spectrum. So 8 individuals equals 3.5 billion. We also heard other numbers like the relationship between economic value and real assets, that it turns out that the preponderance of economic value is as a result of trading and derivatives and not based on actual things. It's the trading going on. So I remember Warren Buffett's incredible line when asked why he didn't invest in derivatives. He said, I couldn't invest in something I can't understand. So this idea of real things is important. And when we get to the real things, then we get to regulations, and that's where the government comes in often. And the government needs to regulate if it's concerned about commercial activities that damage the public. And so then we have to expect that. On the other hand, we can also start designing things that don't require regulation. Just imagine, as a 100% fabulous moment, the day we don't need to be regulated because there's nothing to fear. So what could the government do about this? Well, if you think about it, encourage the removal of regulations. That sounds perverse, probably, but what if they weren't required? What if the government could be benchmarking all the cool things that we do that don't need to be regulated, and tell everybody about them and encourage that? Because it would reduce the cost of regulation and it would increase the benefit of intelligent commerce. So, every opportunity you would go to try and produce multiple benefits. I'm really quizzical on what a wall with Mexico. What benefit could be accrued by that? I'm having a really tough time. Certainly, socially and economically, it's highly problematic. Environmentally, it sounds like a nightmare when you look at running down the middle of the Rio Grande. Over all the mountains and hills, and it sounds like an ecological disaster. But if you stop and think about it as a chance for two countries to engage in a relationship, and you want to spend a lot of money on it, what if Mexico and the United States both built fabulous solar farms along the border to wave at each other and said, welcome, and here's the new world, and we're all sharing our knowledge of how to put up solar collectors. And it's not a wall, it's just the way to power the top half of Mexico and the bottom half of the United States, and we'll all celebrate this together and build a welcome to the future wall and share things with each other. But I think it is a matter of intention, and I think regulations are a signal of design failure, and I think the government can encourage good design and things that don't require regulation, and while they regulate the things that are worrisome, and I think a lot of well-meaning people in government find that very enjoyable way to spend their lives.
I find this an incredibly inspiring concept, and I would love to start a Move On campaign focused on this, Bill. This whole notion of searching for the good is something that is so basic and yet so missed on so many levels.
Well, I think
thank you for sharing this.
So the reason, Coanne, I think it's so core is that if you look at the relationship between Plato and Aristotle, Plato was the search for the good, the bad, the right, the wrong, beauty, culture, form, these ethos of humanity, and then Aristotle, the student, comes along, and in a sense says, well, Plato, this is the wisdom, but the question is, how do we act? So he called it practical wisdom. How do we act? Mm-hmm. And we went through this on another one of the webinars, that you could go from the values expressed by Plato to principles, visions, goals, strategies, tactics, metrics, and then value creation. That's really Aristotle, truth in number and the relationship. So the issue here of the search for the good, for me, is important because I think it's reasonable in language, and that's why the carbon language is not a judgment. Notice that I'm not saying good carbon, bad carbon. I'm saying human behavior is negative or positive, depending on how we act. So yes. If you then look at the idea of the search for good, I think we have a hard time politically, and we have religions and politics for the right and the wrong. And that's a tough conversation for a lot of people. What is right? What is wrong? Depending on where you come from and what you're thinking, the culture. But the good and the bad, it's a little simpler. Clean water is good. Dirty water is bad. I think a child can understand that.
I'd love to see you focusing your opening remarks in Detroit on this whole concept, because I do think it's incredibly powerful and could be approached on many levels. So let's think about that. When you think about redefining the good life, the search for good is a pretty powerful.
The search for good, yeah.
Yeah. Give us a blue sky thought about the ag industry and whether or not you can imagine any kind of disruptive or breakthrough partnerships between the ag industry and some other sector that might have an opportunity to help support positive carbon through soil building. Is there anything you can imagine?
I think there are a whole number. One that I'm particularly curious about is what I call oil to soil. I look at oil as soil without the S. And oil is soil, it's just ancient. And the notion that we could make biodegradable polymers, compostable polymers, from oil, because we have a concentrated carbon source, and do it in a way that's safe and ecologically intelligent, not burn it. That's the last thing we do with it. That's the fugitive. But actually use it as an agricultural mulch for those farmers that are currently using plastics. Like in China, immense amounts of plastic.
Really?
It's amazing. There are places where if you get a shovel out and just start digging a field, you'll bang into plastic films. The largest component of garbage in New York City is plastic films. So imagine if we did have plastic films that would heal soil so we could kickstart the microbes and the fungi and so on. The way compost does it, the way like the Marin Project is showing the way on this, a half inch of compost and everything kicks into gear, starts to accrue. It's quite astonishing, really. So, I think we could even use polymers for this. And it would be a very interesting opportunity. So that is an agricultural use of oil that isn't in just making nitrogen or just the spreading of artifice. It allows the soil to regenerate on its own terms, and I think that's quite.
Are you aware of anybody that's doing that at the moment?
Yes, We're involved with these kinds of things and looking at them. And China is now doing the experiments with them. And hopefully it will go to scale. So that's really an interesting one for me. It's kind of odd. I think that the compost issue is, to me, one of the dynamic ones for my whole life, because we've talked about this before, but I was born in Tokyo and was every night the ox carts would wake us up and my mother would sing songs to us to go back to sleep. But her songs were all about the honey wagons and the night soil and, it was all about beautiful things. She was from Alabama, so she would sing American folk songs in Japanese, making up words about poop. It was amazing. and it was like heaven, as a kid. I mean, it doesn't get better than that. Your mother's singing a song from Alabama in Japanese about poop. It was incredible. So I always thought that the cities and farms were one thing. So we've just finished the first round of working on a new concept we call the carbon positive city, which is essentially could be characterized as a form of agro-urbanism. And the idea would be, how do the cities in a cradle-to-cradle-like way cycle technical nutrients in the form of various, perpetual artifice of metals and polymers, and then in forms of soil regeneration in terms of its sewage and its food and so on. So when we look at sewage treatment plants, I see a nutrient management system, or otherwise known a fertilizer factory. So how are we going to do that so that we don't contaminate the soil with our various materials, and how do we do it in ways that are a benefit to all generations? And that way, if you import food into a city, for example, then you eat it and then you put it into fertilizer, if you can, safely, and then you give it to the local farmers. So all of a sudden, this relationship between the city and the farms become a completely different one. And then you add to that the idea that you could grow food on top of the grocery store and, get rid of all food miles by delivering the vegetables from upstairs downstairs, that kind of thing. So the urban agricultural moment is upon us as well.
A beautiful example of redefining the good life, again. There's another question here about the ag industry in general. Is there any counsel or advice you would give to the ag industry itself about its role in releasing soil carbon and how it could be better managing carbon in a regenerative way?
I think, let's think about what it means to have a good life for farmers. The population of farmers in the United States has obviously dropped, from whatever it was. I think Henry Ford calculated that it was 50% industry when he was in this heyday with the Model A. It was more farmers than urban dwellers and industrial workers. He was there somewhere, I think, at the cusp, and talked about how he thought the ideal population mix in terms of occupations would be 1/2 agriculture, 1/2 industry. And now we're at, I think, 2% agriculture. So, we have farmers that are working with large equipment on large territories using advanced science of various kinds, and but at the same time we're seeing loss of carbon in soil, and for various reasons. And so I think that we could get farmers starting to share the information on some very beautiful projects that are at scale, millions of acres. Various farmers in the Midwest, for example, and people like Tony Michaels and Gary Zimmer, who are doing things where the soil is increasing in vitality every year instead of decreasing, and it's allowing the carbon to do its beautiful work and accrue to everyone's benefit. So I think that we should get the examples out there and shared as best we can. And then I think it is a matter of the population calling for safe, healthy things, because as we look at some of these materials, we're seeing more and more information about potential toxifications and carcinogenicity and this, that, and the other thing, which have got to cause society to pause and ask, is this, uncertainty, or is this danger? Is it, if it's science and it's of concern, can we address it urgently? Because these are matters of toxification. And it's not a matter of being net zero across various. Think about it this way. This is a rather sad example, but if you went to the children of Flint, Michigan, and said, we're going to reduce your lead in your water by 20% by 2025. Really? Could you even say that? And then if you said, well, we're going to be net zero lead, we're going to take the lead out in Lansing equal to the amount you have, so you're going to be net zero lead, kids, because we're going to take it out in Lansing. What? Yeah. We're at fundamental moments of what is good behavior at this point in our history. And then it comes down to those children and their health everywhere, all the time, for all generations. And that's the basic of the public wheel. So this is time for very serious work.
Indeed, and it's very lovely to see more and more people engaged in it. So we're coming to the top of our hour, and I had one interesting question here that I wanted to ask you if I can find it again. I also just really appreciate all of the examples that are being posted by listeners. So if you have other examples that you want to make sure get shared out as part of the archive of this webinar, please do add it in, and we'll include that in the notes. But there's a comment here from somebody you may know personally in Dubai, I'm not sure, who's commenting on your next challenge, which is to develop a new language that will differentiate between manufacturing, machine factoring, and robot factoring. And that is something completely new to me. I was hoping that you could touch a little bit on that, so it's on my radar.
Oh, sure. Actually, it's a language that has been introduced to me by a very close friend of mine from Dubai, Mohammed Khatik, and he's in Dubai, so he may even be simulating this question. He's an amazing observer and one of my teachers, and he and I have gone through this carefully to the extent that we can understand what is going on now in terms of what has gone on before and how we would articulate it, especially in light of the dialogues that are going on with the World Economic Forum, which I get to participate in, on what Klaus Schwab, this recently published book on the subject called The Fourth Industrial Revolution. And what it's looking at is the issues of artificial intelligence and various advanced manufacturing and service provision technique, et cetera, and what are the implications on society when the machines can do learning, for example. And so I think what this refers to is what he and I have been talking about, are that manufacturing, the term, is from the Latin for hand and execute, manufacture. So hand execution, making by hand. So if you just visually imagine a brick being held by someone and it comes to the ground and goes in a wall, and then a person weaving, working by hand, imagine. My grandmother was a weaver. And then knotting, which is rug making. Imagine the exquisite rugs. Given, a family in Beijing would spend an entire generation on one rug. Imagine. Peking rugs were famous around the world, carved. And then obviously the Middle East and so on. So the rugs. And that's manufacturing. Then we see with the mills of Manchester, we see the machines and the looms, and we end up calling it manufacturing. And Gandhi gets nervous. And so it's not manufacturing, it's machine factoring. And then we move from that to robots. Now we have three-dimensional factoring. And then we move to artificial intelligence, where the machines train machines. And they're teaching. And so the question becomes, what are they teaching? And in the search for good, when do the machines understand the difference between right, wrong, good, and bad? Is it a program thing? And is that how we program it? But does that hold? What happens if the machines start learning and they're learning based on optimizations that have characterizations that have nothing to do with good and bad? For example. So what happens when that comes? And so I think we're really at an amazing moment in history where we want to make sure to inform the artificial intelligence of the artifactual concerns of real people and children. And that how do you program love into a machine? That's a really interesting question, I think. So how do we go back to the fact that these are just tools and that we don't judge them? We don't judge artificial intelligence, just as we don't want it to judge us. We don't create the artifice that destroys the artifact of what it means to be a human being or what it means to be on a beautiful planet. It is time.
Super powerful place to leave today, and I'm personally leaving with a desire to do some more thinking about the search for good and the power of that concept at this moment in time. And I'm very delighted to hear from Michelle that you're going to be able to join us in Detroit as we kick off this global conversation around redefining the good life. Bill, I can't imagine a better place to really help set the stage for that conversation. So I'm looking forward to seeing you there and to our subsequent conversations. Again, please do add any other.
Can I mention one thing?
Yes. Yes, please.
I just want to mention one thing. We're working. I've had the privilege of working with the CNA Foundation and working on this Fashion for Good initiative that we're starting to move with, and it's given this exquisite opportunity to have these kinds of conversations in terms of how we come together in the future. So it is a timely subject and literally a good one, and I think the term is a good one too, because when we say in mechanics, I fixed it for good, we are talking about something that's going to last.
Very powerful and something worth giving some good time to think and talk about over the coming year. So thank you for that.